Hi, everyone. One moment while I share my screen.
Andy Peters is going to lead us off with something she came up with.
I'm going to start with this picture. This, for those who may not know, this is Ed Burke. He is a very long-serving Chicago alderman and one of the most famously corrupt individuals in Chicago politics. And he's currently facing decades in prison for racketeering. Essentially, he would use what's called aldermanic privilege to extort business owners into hiring his property tax appeals firm. And so if the businesses wanted to open or get zoning rights, they would need to pay the firm that he owned quite a lot of money. And so I think this really speaks to political culture because the vast majority of Chicagoans regard this type of corruption as just the cost of doing business or the cost of politics. And so what's really striking is that while Burke was facing charges for this in 2019, and while it was pretty clear that he was guilty because they had a wiretap of him saying that he was guilty, he got reelected with 53% of the vote. And he's actually currently serving. His trial's been delayed due to COVID. And what's also interesting about this is the people who initially complained about this racketeering were not from Chicago. They were business owners from Houston. And because they were from Houston, they didn't share this idea that this type of corruption is how things work. They were very confused as to why they should have to hire this guy's law firm in order to open a business. And so I think it really shows, on the one hand, the conflict between this individualistic and traditionalistic political culture in Chicago and how that works when outsiders come to the city. And so I'll link this page. There's a podcast you can listen to about Ed Burke getting reelected and what that says about Chicago's political culture. But I thought that spoke really well to the readings.
Okay, terrific. Well, that's a perfect lead off for the discussion of political culture in the news. I want to now raise 2, 3, 4 levels from what Andy has introduced to show how important this is more generally. The issue has been framed in terms of the history of Chicago politics, and many, more generally, many, if not the general interpretations, the simple interpretation of 20th century American politics, urban politics especially, is between what's called machine and reform. And the machine classic example was Tammany Hall in New York, the Cook County Democratic Party here. These were led by immigrants, Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, who were particularly adept at building this kind of leadership pattern. The reformers were more traditionally white, Protestant, more educated, more often linked to religious Protestant background who would argue that this was immoral. Okay, if that's the quick label, I was then doing a study a couple of decades ago trying to explain, or it was really along with the New York fiscal crisis in the 70s, which cities were spending more money or less money and more likely to have a fiscal crisis, as New York was then having. And the New York fiscal crisis really ended the whole 20th century, or let's say post-World War II, continual growth of spending in American cities, major policy. With that, it flattened off. And we've had bumps up and down ever since, basically. What led to the general growth, and what were some of the factors associated with increased and decreased spending through the 19th, 20th centuries, and where and how is this still with us, as is indicated by the Burke example? I'm giving you briefly the simple growth pattern. I then took many of the simple previously discussed variables in left, right voting and in high, low spending. And a classic model that many start with is the sort of pure democratic model, sometimes identified with Anthony Downs, that citizens want, government can do what citizens want. And so a question would be, then are there different types of citizens in terms of higher or lower growth of spending, and how can we connect these? Blue collar, different ethnic groups, Catholicism. We had data on income, education, unionization. We put these together, and the one which stood out most of all initially was Catholicism, that cities with more Catholics spent more. I pursued this back and forth for up to 5 years. I worked on this. I didn't want to publish it because I didn't want to appear as anti-Catholic. We then dug further and said, well, at least what kinds of, and it didn't go away. That is, we thought, I mean, is this not related to high-low class differences? Answer was no. Weekly. We then looked at what kinds of Catholics were these who spent more. That is, if we look at cities with more Polish residents, with more German residents, were those associated with spending? And the big, strongest, clearest answer was Irish. Irish and Catholics were the big spending cities. Then the next question was why? Was this because Irish Catholics voters as citizens preferred more spending? Answer from surveys was no. Individual Irish Catholic citizens are not that much more leftist in terms of bigger spending versus smaller spending. However, a certain proportion of Irish Catholics, even a minority in Chicago and elsewhere, are very heavily represented in police departments, fire departments, post office in the past, sometimes administrators of, and especially in the Cook County Regular Democratic Party organization. Ed Burke is a classic example. His father was a policeman and then alderman before him, and he's been serving for 50 years. The Dan Ryan Expressway is named for Dan Ryan, who was the president of the Cook County Democratic Party, or the chairman. And his father before him held the same position so the two of them through much of the 20th century carried on a certain style that I began to learn about as I read further. So I spent about, as I said, about 5 years. The major person who helped me on this was Roman Catholic priest, Father Andrew Greeley, who's a PhD in sociology. He taught here for some years when I got him a position when I led the college sociology program. And he's written 50, 60 books on, most of them are novels about Irish Catholic families. The other third to a half are about all sorts of other topics. But he's also a professional sociologist. And so he dealt with Irish Catholic politics as it related to ethnic solidarity and building organizations more generally. So I would read stuff and send them to him. And when I told him about my finding, he said, he was then editing a journal called Ethnicity. And he said, why don't you publish this in the journal called Ethnicity? And as this is great stuff. So I did, and it basically showed the following. You have two kinds of patterns of politics, in a sense, to simplify. This is the clientelist pattern, where we have at the top the leader. The leader gives jobs and contracts to his organizers, in Chicago called precinct captains or city ward committeemen. There are 50 wards in the city of Chicago, and each ward has a ward committeeman. So Ed Burke is really the head of his ward. That's the base, as well as being citywide important. So the precinct captain can do favors for the individual citizen, like so-called fix a parking ticket, a Christmas turkey, cash in some places around the world. In Taiwan, it was known that you had to pay something like $600 US in an envelope of cash to get a vote for the president of Taiwan. So the parties would give different amounts of money, but that was known, that precisely is what you had to pay. Making the point that this is not just Chicago, which we will be elaborating. Then the voter citizens in this model, because they get their payoff, they give their vote back to the leader. That's the triangle, the iron triangle of clientelist politics. There are no parties, or not necessarily a party. There's no program. There's no ideology. This contrasts well, if you will, with the reform pattern, where you have a leader and a citizen. There are no precinct captains in between. And then the leader says, I favor this, versus a second leader who says, I favor that. And based on the ideal program presented by these two leaders, the citizens give their votes based on the ideology and the program. Okay, these are two simplified ideal types. In reality, we have some of this everywhere. In US national politics, Donald Trump talking about his family and his company is obviously an element of clientelism, and he's attacked on this, and he attacked crooked Hillary, so-called. He termed her in the 2016 election for using clientelist patterns of giving speeches to Wall Street bankers, etc. But if this is clientelism, who does it and why? And where is it more legitimate, or where is it fought? That was the question which I asked. And after 5 years of working on this, I basically broke it up into those 5 different arrows of different things going this way and that way, and then looked to see how much were there differences between Irish Catholics and others, and found that in most of these things, Irish Catholics were much more leaning in the clientelist direction, not just because of the politics, but because of the Roman Catholic Church. Something like 60-70% of Irish Catholics say they go to church every Sunday. Something like 60-70% say they send their children to parochial school. In contrast, Italian Catholics, maybe 20%. Italian Catholics also say they don't believe in God very much. Same is true in Italy. Nevertheless, they go to church in Italy. There's a familism in Italy, but not an institutional support for the rules of the game that work in the same way as the Irish. The lacking element, critical, which the Irish add, is trust. The sense that if you do me a favor to the precinct captain, the favor will be returned. And that sense of trust, not in the law, not in law and order, not in the Constitution and the like, but in the specific favor you did. the material reward, not ideology, material in that sense, is the driver of classic clientelism. And this is true if you then go back to Ireland, Irish national local politics is very heavily this way and written about for years. Southern Italy, written about in detail by Robert Putnam in his book on Italy. So these are the two countries that have engendered the most extensive literature, Ireland and Italy. And within the US, these two ethnic groups have been major. Within New York City, the Democratic Party was really led from the 1920s onward by the Italians. Jews were more important in the unions, and sometimes they would come together, as in Fiorello LaGuardia, who was half part Jewish and part Italian. But basically, there's a stronger reform element in New York, as illustrated by his own family background, which in contrast, Chicago has a much weaker Jewish cultural tradition, as the Jews and the abstract white Protestants have a more abstract ideological reform style, which we also find in Hyde Park, which is the major exception to this Irish Catholic style, centered most of all in Bridgeport, the neighborhood. The title of my paper was called the Irish Ethic, ETHIC, and the Spirit of Patronage, a play on Max Weber, of course. And however, as soon as it came out, it was featured in the Boston Globe as Irish Ethnic linked to fiscal chaos. That was their headline. This then got played up in New York as well. And a week or so later, there were letters from Irish organizations in New York and Boston to the president of the University of Chicago, say, you should fire this young assistant professor who's saying irresponsible things. He's anti-Irish, et cetera, et cetera. So this went on for some time, which I was fearful of happening. Is if you look at the paper, I'm not anti-Irish at all. I was trying to celebrate where and how it worked. But the public reaction in that sense was not looking for the subtleties. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was in the Senate at the time, professor at Harvard. He invited me to his last class at Harvard to present this because he wanted to say, and he said this explicitly, he wanted to say that this was recognized as a serious contribution to scholarship and should be celebrated in that way, even in his last class at Harvard, and recognized that most people in Boston and even at Harvard had not seen the importance of that. This was not simply, if you will, ethnic battle. These kinds of issues are still with us as we discuss diversity, as we will. And so I'm making a link between models of political culture on the one hand and diversity, but if that's the quick story, let me go into the generalization and where and how this works across the US. I already showed you this in a simplified version of the Daniel Elazar, our main reading for this section, one of our two main readings. And I'll just show you again the little picture which summarizes Elazar map of the migration patterns across the US. New England, Middle Atlantic, and South. And so the immigrants from each of these three regions, as they went west, carried their political culture and their general culture with them. So you had people from New England who went to Northern Illinois. You had people from the Middle Atlantic who went to parts of Chicago, and then you had people from the South who went to Southern Illinois. But as we have migrations from the South into Chicago, we have all three of these political cultures inside Chicago in the past and today. The dynamics of migration, however, were too simple. Daniel Elazar recognized this, so he came and really wanted to work with me. We worked together for years, so because he wanted to model change, and change comes with the factors discussed in the new political culture book. But let me say a few more words about Elazar historically and to generalize this globally. The ancient Greeks and the Israelites were the key examples leading, he argues, to Western civilization. They also generated monotheism, which Elazar links to the idea of progress, by contrast to the cyclical views of history characterized in most polytheistic civilizations, which worshiped many gods in their own natural habitats. Southern Italians would go into, even more recently in Banfield's book, he describes, they'll go in with a candle, shake it in front of one of the statues, which should provide water and rain and good harvest, and say, I'll burn this candle for you after you give me the rain, but I don't trust you to give me the rain, so I won't burn my candle until then, illustrating the lack of trust even within the church among Southern Italians. The Greeks and Jews codified their philosophy and theology in the Bible, Old and New Testament. Philo, a Jew from the Hellenic city of Alexandria, codified both into a single system adapted from Christianity and became the core ideas of Western civilization for roughly 1600 years until Spinoza challenged it. Meanwhile, the Middle East and much of the large empires were continually changing with war. Egypt, Asia Minor, Babylonians, Persians. Similarly, in India and China, although their religions and the caste system persisted in most religions, speaking to the durability of religion as core element of civilization. Even Daniel Bell stresses the same point in his book called The Rise of Post-Industrial Society. His core is religion. Next simple phase was Martin Luther, who compromised with the political leaders in Germany, and then Lutheranism became the state church in many of the regions of Germany. There was no German nation when he was alive. Lutheranism, official, state linked tightly. Calvin, French young priest, was more radical. He was the second major force within Protestantism, but he said Lutheranism is a sellout to the political leaders. The leaders of each church should be chosen by their own members in democratic, egalitarian manner. If not formally elected, then chosen by discussion with the local officials, not with the political or the church leaders, as is done, of course, by the Roman Catholic Church, as well as the Lutherans. And so today, so Calvin immediately almost left France as the French burned and killed Protestants. He went and spent most of his life in Switzerland, and the two continental countries who were the most visible here are the Netherlands and Switzerland, with Calvinist Protestantism. And then there were elements of this which went to Normandy, and with the Norman invasion, you had elements of Norman Scandinavian, which became in part was so-called non-conformist, non-Church of England Protestantism. And then up and down, depending on the periods of English history, these non-conformists were persecuted, not allowed to practice law, not allowed to teach in universities, and so forth. And then when times were difficult for them, they either went back to the Netherlands or they went to New England. And so New England, and this is the background for Daniel Elazar's map, This is why New England was so quintessentially Protestant. It drained the leaders who had been Oxford professors who were fired, people who were practicing law who were fired, theologians, etc. So much of the English elite then went and founded Harvard and continued this in the very religiously engaged churches of New England, differing by sect and orientation between Maine and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and etc. The frontier then was the edge of this, and so as people migrated west and on horseback or in covered wagons, they carried their values with them, and it diffused westward. Westward is the basic model. But the additional idea of Elazar was that the frontier, as you settled a new state or a new town, a new farm, you tend to be more egalitarian with the people who were also new. The weight of tradition was less strong on your shoulders. And so as you went west, the ethnic patterns got weaker, and the egalitarian populist style became more and more important. In the same way that as you have suburbs outside of cities, from New York and Chicago to Los Angeles, the style of the central city becomes weaker. The central city classically illustrated by Burke here. I'll add as well to link this to Chicago that the assumed next mayor of Chicago was Toni Preckwinkle, who had been alderman in this area where I live in Bronzeville, in the northern part of Hyde Park. She's a USC graduate. She, in the polls, when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, she got twice as many citizens supporting her for mayor, but she did not run. She still is serving as president of the Cook County Board, the county. But she ran for mayor, and it looked as if she was going to win. But then Ed Burke, who we saw introduced, held a fundraiser for her and for others a few weeks before the election. And this in turn tarnished her when another candidate, Laurie Lightfoot, said, all of these people you see except me are corrupt. And she was so aggressive and so successful that she basically destroyed Toni Preckwinkle's strong established track record as a reformer, as a citizen leader, as a Tocquevillian. She and is a major force, especially in African American politics. She launched Obama, etc. Okay, so I'm showing you how Burke was important, and there are many other things, many more stories I can tell about him over many years. He was the major leader. Just one is he was a major leader fighting against Harold Washington when Harold Washington was the first African American mayor, and he won. Harold did, by running on reform as his program. That was his main program, and when Daley would say it's a father's duty to help his sons, Harold Washington, when he was attacked by the press for having people in the city hall who took bribes, he said, if this is discovered and validated, we will prosecute this sort of violation to the full extent of the law. The person will be fired and prosecuted. So he took a reform position in ways that Daley 1 did not. Daley 2, what was his position on these issues? The son of Daley, who served almost as long as his father. Did he look like his father? Yes. Did he talk like his father? Yes, he spoke Chicago public school English. Did he wear the same suits? Yes. He carried the same sort of briefcase, same sort of style. But his public official politics came more from Harold Washington than they did from his own father. Okay, people have laughed when I've said that, but look at the details, listen to what he himself has said. And under the table, under the table, Daley too had developed or did develop an HDO, an Hispanic Democratic Organization, which worked like his version of the Cook County machine. But it was not an official, open kind of activity. He denied. He would agree with Harold Washington. If anyone in my administration is found taking bribes, they will be fully prosecuted. Daley too would take the position, the reform position. So in that sense, the official political culture was shifted by Harold Washington in Chicago to reform, even if there were exceptions, and there still were and are exceptions, most visibly Burke. Okay. Let me pause there for any questions, as I've covered a fair amount fairly rapidly. Any questions on any of these points?
So when you were referencing earlier the Irish Catholic.
Can you turn on your camera easily, or don't have to, but if it's easy, fine.
Oh,
Mary?
yeah.
Okay,
Hi.
good. Right. Good.
Earlier when you were talking about the Irish Catholics and the sort of like trust that they had with the, like, when they would do like a favor for,
Yeah.
and like the favors that were going through. Can you run through that one more time, just with the it was like the precinct.
Yes.
Thank you.
The leader could be the mayor, like Mayor Daley. A precinct, so a ward committeeman, and so we could say could be Edward Burke. So Burke could be the ward committeeman, and then below him he would have maybe 30, 50 precinct captains in each neighborhood. My building, one high-rise apartment, is one precinct, and we have a precinct captain in the building. So the precinct captain works for the mayor and the party because he gets a full-time job, ideally. He may be a full-time employee of the parks and in the parks let's say in City Hall. So he gets a job, or he may be a contractor who has a demolition company. Like Hennigan is a big Irish demolition company, and they've got lots of big contracts and scandals now, but they still have got these contracts years after the Irish are no longer supposed to be important in Chicago. So the contracts and jobs drive these major big time supporters of the mayor, who give maybe lots of money to the mayor as well, if you're a big contractor. Then these people, like the precinct captain or the contractor, hire other people, or let's say, don't say hire. They may do a little bit of hiring. Usually these are smaller, cheaper favors. Jane Byrne famously said, I spend $11 million every year on Christmas turkeys for only one reason: love. Okay. Jane Byrne was Irish Catholic. This was just normal. This is how you express your love. You give a Christmas turkey to African Americans, to poor people who need to be supported, and you expect a vote to come back. That's the Irish triangle. It's not uniquely Irish. It's Southern Italian. It is Chinese. It is African. It is Thai. It is Brazilian, and it is found in the American South with small white Protestant towns. So African Americans learned this not just in Chicago, they also learned this in small towns where you had to be white, but you also had to do favors for the county people. And so Faulkner's novels discuss the Snopes, and the county store was owned by someone, and if you wanted to get a house in a town, you could buy a house from someone who was Mr. Snopes, and he would say, I'll let you have the house, and I'll let you pay for half of it, and you can pay for the second half as you harvest. You give me some of your harvest, but you must buy all of your tools, all your feed, all your food from me in the county store. So that's the same kind of pattern. That the clientelist pattern is not one of ideology, it's not left, right, it's not party, it's a clientelist individual in a relationship. Okay, there's a big literature on this by Irish and Italian political scientists, a little bit in the US, but it's a heavily visible pattern around the world. In the words of the critics, it is corruption, but what's changed is this is not just regional, this is not just one ward. With the rise of education, of income, the decline of strong parties, the rise of organizations internationally, like the World Bank, that are prosecuting political leaders who take World Bank loans and then use them to renovate their private homes, they're going to jail, or at least they're being prosecuted legally, and the money is being taken away from them in ways that citizens have applauded. And so Russian leaders, French leaders, Brazilian leaders have had these kinds of run-in with the World Bank, and successfully. That is, put differently, as clientelism has been labeled corruption internationally, and as citizens have grown more and more important with the rise of education, with the rise of the media, with the rise of cell phones, clientelism traditionally, as it was fought, is losing, at least publicly, at least at the national level and visibly. Nevertheless, it is still being implemented in many areas of the world, and still probably remains the dominant pattern of political leadership. Although something like these two patterns are going on inside China, inside India, and Nigeria, and so forth. And NPR covers a lot of this on a scandal day-by-day sort of basis. This is in part the themes that are informing the second reading in our section, called the new political culture, which basically, let me see if I've got I want to show you if I can, I try to give you a one picture summary of these big stories or bigger themes. And the background of the new political culture is twofold. Clientelism coming from agricultural traditional hierarchies on the one hand, and class politics coming from the factory, the Marxist kind of industrial organization on the other. The new political culture basically is an extension of reform, but it goes one step further. And the summary is on page 37, which I will hold up and show you right here. And it has three boxes, three or really four boxes, in a later version that we've developed. But within each of these three boxes, we have what the three boxes are: government, economic, and social policies. And within each, we have a rise of individualism and the decline of hierarchy and inequality over a longer term. This is not 5 years, this is often 50 or 100 years that these took place. Driven by the decline of agriculture and manufacturing, the rise of high tech, of services, information services, more high incomes, but I'd say especially more. Well, in the economic box, we stress income. In the social box, we stress the rise of education as leading to more tolerance and leading to the slimmer family, women working, daughters finding jobs, not just getting married at a young age and raising families, related to more tolerance of the individual and group variations, diversity, if you will, there. The third box is government, which with its expansion of welfare state programs have to varying degrees, quote, solved the more urgent problems of the past. The most visible health, unemployment kinds of issues have been adopted by Republicans as well as Democrats in the US and much more extensively in the European continent. The combination of these three we call the new political culture. Okay, so these diagrams are stated in some 25 or so individual propositions, and we go through then evidence to support each of them briefly in the text, and then elsewhere we have 7 books which elaborate these ideas with data for US mayors, from citizen surveys internationally, and then books on adapting this to individual countries in translation in Japan, in France, in Spain, in Latin America, Chinese. Okay, so these.
I had a question.
Yep. Okay, go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering. I think this is probably a kind of simplistic question, but would you, I guess, overall say that the decline of clientelism or overt clientelism is overall a positive or negative change in the political system?
Yeah. Now the good to raise it, and my answer. My crude, simple answer is yes, no, and maybe. But behind that, the question is, it depends on the political culture. And I'm not an advocate of any one political culture. I have explicitly and consciously myself consulted with mayors of all these different orientations, and I've consciously worked with and collaborated with people, now most recently, most actively in China, to understand where and how their political cultures work and are implemented in specific institutions and rules of the game, when children take care of their parents or not, where you need the welfare state instead to help with elderly, etc. So I would say what we try to show in this course in the readings is not that you should do this or that, but to ask, why is Ed Burke successful? Whether you like him or not, you should be able to analyze better how and why he's successful. Otherwise, even if you want to kill him, now don't kill him is too simple. If you want to destroy him politically, what will work? And the answer is not to have more citizen support, because he's got in his ward a lot of people voting for him. A majority voted for him, even though he was in jail or on probation, whatever. Similarly, something like 75 of the I won't give you a number. That is, they're large. They're 50 city council members, aldermen, so-called, in Chicago. Over the last 20, 30 years, a huge number of these have been on probation. Many have gone to jail, and so forth. So there are jokes, there are great jokes about this. If you have a party of the aldermen, you say not invited unless indicted. We're called machine politicians because we're coin operated, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say understanding where and why this is tolerated, where and why it's seen as it's embraced and seen as legitimate, or where this is seen as totally, worse than sin of every sort, and where and why different groups embrace alternative views of legitimacy. So that's what I want to try to get to. And the quick answer is it depends on the political culture, but then where and how and why, what are the components of that and how do they work, we'll pursue through the rest of this course. And then show, for instance, how the arts can enhance the emotional power of these religious and moralistic or non-moralistic views. Okay, that's the quick answer. But so keep reading and stay tuned, and keep asking and looking for the same question and how it's answered. For reasons of time, I want to get into the next section, and so I'm not going to go into much detail on these themes today, unless you have something else that you want to raise right now? I'm deliberately leaving you a little bit frustrated, saying I want to have a little more, and it's there in the readings. Okay. But anybody want to ask a provocative question? Yeah, Mary?
Yeah, I'm just curious. You talked about it earlier. You touched on it briefly, just the concept of like how there were different Catholics from like different areas that all like have their different ways of like corruption, to put it like bluntly, that like have their different ways of like. Do you think that that has something to do with just like tradition since they've come to the United States, or do you think that that dates back farther in a sense of like, because you're saying like the Irish have their like clientelism that they do, and then like the Italians that came from Southern Illinois that you were referring to, is it like a geographical, that's just the way that things have always been, or is there a different reason? Because technically they're all the same like religion. So I guess it's just interesting to me that they have these different ways of like their political machine, I guess.
I mean, that's a major question which drives this course as well as next quarter's course called Global Local Politics. And the answers are very complicated. I mean, the long answer is it's quote history, but if we don't want to leave history just to the historians, that is, there's some bigger, more general, interesting points which we can elaborate, as I did with the Faulkner novel example, to illustrate clientelism in a Protestant white example. So the degree to which, for example, this then changed when you have people migrating from the South or migrating to the West is what there's also, and so Elazar's concept is the frontier, that the frontier tends to change your more hierarchical traditional views to more egalitarian and participatory. But there are many other things. And so the way I showed it in this picture in the New Political Culture book in these 3 boxes is to show in general terms, a list of variables which are then spelled out in the rest of the book in specific propositions. But to simplify, income is very important in transforming. Income and production and jobs are critically important in leading to sort of a market individualism, whereas education is particularly important in driving tolerance within the family, gender roles, parents to children's relationships, the responsibility of children to take care of their parents when they retire, which is still a major policy debate going on in Asia right now. In Western Europe and the US, it's largely shifted. The children have given up much of their childlike responsibilities in contrast to the Asians. But this is not true universally. So you have within the US, since, for instance, I had a Korean student who came to me. She was about to graduate from the college, and she said, I don't know what I don't know what to do. And I said, can you give me your advice? What should I do? And I said, what? Please tell me more. My mother says I should get a job which will buy her a new Mercedes right away. My father says, no, you want to go and you want to be an architect or an artist, go ahead and do what you want, forget about your mother. She didn't know what to do. So, I mean, that's an example of changes within the student culture and from parent to parents, even at the U of C. So, another quick example, Jews were a closed, discriminated against minority in the 19th through a good chunk of the 20th century. In the 21st century, Jews are marrying non-Jews in a majority. That is roughly 50% plus of Jews are not marrying Jews. So in that sense, even the marital relationship is changing, and the culture of a more closed ethnic group. And the Jews were among the most articulate, most clear, most coherent leaders of a proud, specific minority within the US, Commentary magazine in the lead, for instance, and so forth. So these are just some quick examples of the past dynamics. So yes, there is continuity. And so going back and using things like the World Values Survey, which is a survey of citizens in Ireland and Italy, in China, in Nigeria, and then seeing what people's values were there and are there now, and then comparing those to, say, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and seeing how similar these are, and then comparing Boston and Chicago on the one hand to Houston and San Diego on the other, we find big differences. So in the New Political Culture book, we have 4 mayors in 4 cities that are used as cases, and 3 of the mayors are Irish Catholic. But one is Pete Wilson in San Diego, who was a Republican and a classic traditional businessman Republican, in contrast to Kevin White in Boston, who was a classic Democrat, who when Proposition 2.5 passed in Massachusetts, the taxpayers' revolt, Kevin White said, the citizens do not understand. They want the services which we've always been providing. We are asking the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to lend us all that amount of money because we can't raise it in taxes. Please lend us the money and we will continue our exact same budget as in the past. Okay, so that's a classic Democratic Party leader answer, denying the validity of the citizens and stressing the role of the party in the hierarchy in the traditional. So Boston. The third case was Mayor Pete Flaherty of Pittsburgh, who when he had with the riots going on in the 60s, he'd wander around in black neighborhoods. He was a supporter of African Americans. He had a sense of citizens. So he went to Notre Dame Law School. He was seen as a classic Irish Catholic political leader in the city council for 10 years. But when he ran for mayor, his program said, Pete, nobody's boy. And he fought against the church as a political leader, against the Democratic Party. And he fought and he sought to empower the individual citizens and develop this new political culture, fighting with those around him. So in this sense, the Irish Catholics have been much more political than other Catholics, but also very smart and successful and adaptable, because the clientelist style has no ideology. It's easier to change than it is if you were committed to one strong ideology. Okay, so that's a quick overview as an answer, linking these ideas, which then continue as well in the book called Scenescapes, just to show you the linkage. The idea there is that there are 15 dimensions of scenes, and you could call these are little political cultures. They're little views of what's right and wrong. But we have all of these 15 things are mixed in all of us, in our personality identities, in our cities, in our neighborhoods, transgression, localism, neighborliness, and so forth. These are smaller elements than just the Irish. So rather than looking for one way that the Irish do things, I'm illustrating with 3 different Irish mayors who went in different directions. One stressing more the relationship of followers in a populist way, which Pete Flaherty did, which led him to break with the traditional Irish way of giving jobs and contracts to people who support you. So the Irish ethic thus was broken up and used in different ways by Pete Wilson and when he became Republican. And so Andy Greeley in his novels will have within the same family people fighting over these things, and showing as the Irish from the 1960s onward, these patterns grew weaker within Irish Catholic families, even in Chicago, in his as illustrated in his novels, for instance. Okay, so that's the beginning of an answer, but we will have more as we proceed. Let me see. Let me push on just to get started with the idea of urban innovation, as we want to catch up a little bit, get this started, and it's a longer section. The title and the ideas go back for a long way. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, talked about economic growth is driven by invention and new ideas. Jane Jacobs in the, we'll talk about a little more. But it crystallized in the book by Richard Florida called The Rise of the Creative Class. And then his other books, Cities and the Creative Class, and Who's Your City? Most of this was not original to him. That is, his Rise of the Creative Class was powerful because it resonated with what many people felt and what they saw around them within the Microsoft offices, on Wall Street and other places. And he shows this chapter by chapter in reviewing work on psychological personality studies, on management in offices, in business school research, in child rearing patterns, in a variety of domains. He shows how the literature by many social scientists, by journalists, by more popular writers comes together and illustrates these same concerns, that people are not simply rewarded because of tradition or because of hierarchy or because of ethnicity, but also because they've got a new idea. And they may break visibly with their past, such as having tattoos. So Florida features a top student at Carnegie Mellon when he was teaching there, who was covered head to toe with tattoos, but who got the highest. He was hired by one of the big tech companies and earned the highest salary of any graduate in his class of these mostly engineers at Carnegie Mellon, by being not only tattooed, but also being very smart and creative. And so he then points to Silicon Valley as an outgrowth of the gay lifestyle of more tolerance in San Francisco. And so that has been a challenge. So he then did a paper in a chapter in parts of the book, which suggested that neighborhoods and cities with gays have more tolerance, and tolerance leads to more creativity and meritocracy, which in turn leads to more innovation. Okay, so that kind of argument was seen as a bit wild. That, I mean, are you saying people would say that gays cause high-tech jobs? And he said, no, the gays are the canary in a sense. They illustrate tolerance and more general things. Nevertheless, was this the magnitude of this association really strong? So Ed Glazer and I was first, Ed followed up and framed this in terms of the human capital approach. I showed basically that the gays were spurious, that they may have added something, but the main effect was what, as I've shown in the box of education, it was just that, education. That education is the main driver of tolerance. And in that sense, tolerance of gays or tolerance of diverse lifestyles is most heavily simply driven by education, plus communication, the internet, plus travel, plus other related factors, which are in the propositions in that and related books on the new political culture. The ideas have then been continued internationally in this second reading, and we'll go back and forth with Florida and the others. But the international reading is this: Kentuckville Karaoke. Tocqueville's idea, that is the core ideas, there are two propositions in this book. Both come from the West, and we take them to Asia, and we say, do these things work in Asia? And the answer is no. That these two fundamental ideas about how the world works don't work in Asia. So one is Tocqueville, that citizen participation, and I'll show that this. So this is the simplest one to show in one picture. This is on page 18 of the book, and it's basically shows you that the top line is that model one, citizen participation leads to trust positively. The second line is citizen participation, zero in the path to trust. Instead, other things, non-civic variables, family, question mark, may lead to this. The negative, well, okay, so the fourth model is the negative. The 1 and 2 are just a positive sign and a negative sign. Negative being the strong case being Latin America. Latin America, maybe 8% of Latin Americans say they trust their leaders. They trust the national government. 80% to 90% of Scandinavians say they trust their leaders and their governments and their national governments. Huge differences worldwide. China is very, very high. Is it because of citizen participation when there's a strong communist party? No. Then what explains trust in China? That's a big question. We're still exploring and people are disagreeing over it. But the point is, in this book, where and why do these Western models need to be revised in order to work in Asia and around the world if we look more closely? And so the three parts of the book. The third part is the arts. And the point is that the arts can shift the ways that these normal processes have worked. And the arts can be combined even with the internet in ways that make these things work differently. So, okay, I won't try to get to the arts until we get to that section in more specific detail, but I wanted to get out the main event. And mention, well, we got a bit of time. Let me encourage more questions as we go ahead. You've heard a one sentence crisp summary of the key big points of these sections. Questions or reactions, those of you, especially if you've done reading and you want to follow up and help others start to get involved with some of the readings. But if you've not, and you feel and you have something which strikes you as obviously wrong or questionable, or you want to hear more about, please comment. Who wants to raise a question or comment? Two of you have raised good points. Anybody else? One thing I want to mention is terms of the background debates. And where these emerged historically, and then where they differ by city. It's good. I mean, it's a nice simple story to choose, say, 4 cities, 4 mayors, 4 different patterns, as we do in the new political culture. But within those cities, you've got big debates going on. So we chose them because and this illustrates as well a way to join the case study of one city pursued in depth with a more general proposition. For instance, gays, or tolerance, or citizen empowerment, or left-right big spending versus lower spending. And showing in that way how even the ethnic background of diversity, as it is now much discussed in the US in terms of, I mean, the diversity comes from the civil rights African-American example and its mobilization with Martin Luther King. This was then more generally discussed in commentary. Jews began to talk about this in more abstract terms. And then the next soon thereafter, you had a phase of this crystallized in books by Catholic intellectuals, Andy Greeley and others. And you then had white Catholic groups, Irish, Polish, Italian, German, discussing how we can also mobilize along our ethnic lines. The next phase, in a sense, was age. So you had the Gray Panthers organized, of saying, you know, we the elderly can organize as Gray Panthers, and who says you have to have it be an ethnic group? And so the American Association, the AA, the American Association of Retired Persons is the largest lobby for Social Security, which is the largest investment lobby in the United States, just to show you some of the ironies of this and of subgroups, which is the largest single, and I think it's the largest single investor, at least type of investor in the US. Is it Wall Street capitalists? Or who gives their money to Wall Street? That is, the Wall Street capitalists are mostly, the Wall Street people are mostly managers. They invest other people's money, but we're the big organizations that come in with the big dollar amounts. What's the biggest one? University professors. And it's called TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, and CREF. It's a massive organization, and it's ironic because university professors are usually on the left, especially those in the humanities, many in the social sciences, not so among necessarily engineers and others, but to have university professors' retirement funds heavily funding Wall Street is ironic in the sense that we have diversity in the roles in which in the ways that you can have social and fiscal pressures. So you have university professors saying, especially the younger ones saying, let's press our organization to only invest in ecological friendly groups, not to invest in anything that goes to Russia or South, and it used to be in the old days, initially it was South Africa, and so forth. And we're having more active investment debates like that. But another example is New York City, where we had the emergence of the ideal of reform being fought against Tammany Hall. So Tammany Hall was the Irish, Italian, Catholic political organization, and the reform ideal, or let's go back even before New York and say the reform ideal, as it was written up in one PhD thesis, was done by a guy named Robert Moses. And the reform ideal, as it was crystallized in New York, went back to, for him, England. Was this old English history? No. This was late 19th century English history only. It was called Victorian, and the London School of Economics had people who did this in detail and wrote up how law should be written, how reform, how the civil service should be the way that you recruit, you train, you advance people through exams, not through giving favors, not jobs and contracts, but learning more how to do it, bringing in professional expertise, testimony, legal testimonies, and so forth. Okay, so Robert Moses wrote this up in his PhD and then became the man behind the scenes of many mayors in New York City in the late 20th century after World War II. And he was then written up in turn by a journalist named Robert Caro in a book called The Power Broker, used widely in public policy and political science courses, as he was seen as a very much a power broker. And he became more and more arrogant in implementing new policies, which he felt were the future, that the future was better transportation and the suburbs. And to link the suburbs back with the central city of New York, he built freeways that crossed a lot of Long Island, especially. And he then tried to improve the bridges and the access to all of Manhattan, including New Jersey. And so he then had a proposal to tear down all the buildings across the lower end of Manhattan, including all of Greenwich Village or much of Greenwich Village, and to put in a freeway straight across Manhattan. Okay, this seemed so ridiculously arrogant to one lady named Jane Jacobs that she organized opposition to Moses, and she totally carried the day. But it was a symbolic triumph of, and she did this roughly from 1960 to 1968, writing books, organizing meetings, and building a lot of the rationale, the ideas, which then merged with students on campuses, the anti-Vietnam War protest against Lyndon Johnson, the unionization of municipal employees, and these transformed much of the style of reform away from simply the professional leadership of, say, transportation engineers, and instead included more active citizen participation on the street, eyes on the street, where was one of her classic phrases. And so this continues with us today, and these debates continue with us today. In ways that we see in the leadership of the city of Chicago, from Harold Washington through the next mayor of the next mayors, not always and directly, but Rahm Emanuel was the most visibly reform mayor, and Lori Lightfoot has been elected, at least, by combining, in a sense, anti-establishment style of Jane Jacobs with the reform slogans of don't support the establishment, which is corrupt, including Tony Preckwinkle and Ed Burke. So I will end where we began with Ed Burke, but point out the ironic combinations of these subcultures, ethnicity, values, programs in ways that we will continue to explore. Because when you get away from the abstract ideals to the specific candidates and people and cities and policies, things are a mix. They're not a pure ideal type. They're a combination of ideal types. So where and how much we can combine these are what we try to do analytically in books like the Scenescapes book and elsewhere as we proceed. Okay, read on, and we'll see you on Wednesday. We'll have office hours today for anybody who wants to stay on, as we do each Monday. And we will see the rest of you Wednesday. Thank you, two of you, for raising good questions. Cheers, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Muhammad Ali, who did last time very well.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, recording off, I guess.